Here's a debate that Jordan Peterson did about Marxism, for which he prepared by reading one single pamphlet.
How did I prepare for this? I familiarized myself to the degree that it was possible with Slavoj Zizek's work, and that wasn't that possible because he has a lot of work and he's a very original thinker, and this debate was put together in relatively short order. And what I did instead was return to what I regarded as the original cause of all the trouble, let's say, which was the Communist Manifesto. And what I attempted to do, because that's Marx, and we're here to talk about Marxism, let's say, and what I tried to do was read it.
So Peterson couldn't read much Zizek, so what he tried to do was read the Communist Manifesto. And as we'll see, his Cliff Notes level understanding of Marxism is based pretty much exclusively on that.
This ancient problem of hierarchical structure is clearly not attributable to capitalism because it existed long in human history before capitalism existed, and then it predated human history itself. So the question then arises, why would you necessarily, at least implicitly, link the class struggle with capitalism, given that it's a far deeper problem?
Does Peterson think that Marx believed that class struggle didn't exist before capitalism? One of the central ideas of Marxism is that class struggle put capitalism in power, not the other way around. Marx says it was the class struggle of the capitalist bourgeoisie against the aristocracy that got us to where we are today. Marx is not blaming capitalism for class struggle. He believes class struggle to be a mechanism that drives history itself. This is basic introductory Marxism.
But the other thing that Marx didn't seem to take into account is that there are far more reasons that human beings struggle than their economic class struggle, even if you build the hierarchical idea into that, which is a more comprehensive way of thinking about it. Human beings struggle with themselves, with the malevolence that's inside themselves, with the evil that they're capable of doing, with the spiritual and psychological warfare that goes on within them. And we're also actually always at odds with nature. And this never seems to show up in Marx. And it doesn't show up in Marxism in general. It's as if nature doesn't exist.
Peterson could have just Googled for mentions of nature in Marx's writing to know that this isn't true. In the very first chapter of the very first volume of Das Kapital, he says that labor is an eternal nature-imposed necessity without which there can be no material exchanges between man and nature and therefore no life. So not only does Marx mention nature, he blames nature, not class or class struggle, for imposing the necessity of labor upon us.
Marx also assumes that you can think about history as a binary class struggle with clear divisions between, say, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And that's actually a problem because it's not so easy to make a firm division between who's exploiter and who's exploitee, let's say, because it's not obvious, like in the case of small shareholders, let's say, whether or not they happen to be part of the oppressed or part of the oppressor.
Not true. Marx understood that class was not binary and that there exists a partially capitalist, partially wage-dependent class called the petit bourgeoisie. Now to Zizek. Zizek would not have been my choice to defend Marxism, in part because of his cringy, boomer-esque takes with respect to refugees in the LGBT community, and partly because, while he calls himself a Marxist or a communist, he uses these terms rather idiosyncratically. He is not in favor of the abolition of capitalism. Rather, he seems to use the word communism to refer to non-market-based intervention with respect to certain problems that he believes cannot be solved by markets, like ecological problems, the problems that could arise from some technologies, etc.
More than a century ago, in his Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky warned against the dangers of godless moral nihilism. If God doesn't exist, then everything is permitted. The French philosopher André Glucksmann applied Dostoevsky's critique of godless nihilism to September 11th. And the title of his book, Dostoevsky in Manhattan, suggests, as this title suggests, he couldn't have been more wrong. The lesson of today's terrorism is that if there is a God, then everything, even blowing up hundreds of innocent bystanders, is permitted to those who claim to act directly on behalf of God.
Peterson loves to claim that without theism, people would be morally unmoored, and he often cites Dostoevsky when making this claim. But I like Zizek's point that theists can be at least, if not more, ethically reckless if they can convince themselves and others that their own whims, no matter how horrible, are the will of an all-powerful God. Peterson thinks that the idea of a God restrains people, but it seems to me like it can just as easily be used to give people license to do whatever they want.
The same goes also for godless Stalinist communists. They are the ultimate proof of it. Everything was permitted to them since they perceived themselves as direct instrument of their divinity, of the historical necessity of progress towards communism.
In other words, communist dictators were not evil because they were atheist, but on the contrary, because they deified themselves in their ideology.
The solution is not for the rich Western countries to receive all immigrants, but somehow to try to change the situation which creates massive waves of immigration. And we are complicit in this. Is such a change a utopia? No. The true utopia is that we can survive without such a change. So here I think, I know it's provocative to call this a plea for communism. I do it a little bit to provoke things. But what is needed is nonetheless in all these spheres, I claim, ecology, digital control, unity of the world, capitalist market, which does great things, I admit it, has to be somehow limited, regulated, and so on.
This is really all Zizek means when he calls himself a communist and advocates communism.
So I heard much of what I heard. I agreed with, but we can get to that. I'm going to respond.
Keep that. Pull out the knife.
All right. All right. Well, I heard a criticism of capitalism, but no real support of Marxism.
I think Zizek made it clear that he wasn't going to support Marxism in the sense of promoting a revolution and dictatorship of the proletariat or any such thing. Since that's the case, Peterson ought to have focused on rebutting what Zizek actually advocated, which was essentially a state-regulated market economy.
And that's an interesting thing, because for me, the terms of the argument were, well, there were three terms of the argument, let's say. There was capitalism, there was Marxism, and there was happiness. And I would say Dr. Zizek focused probably more on the problems of capitalism and the problems of happiness than on the utility of Marxism. And that actually comes as a surprise to me, because I presumed that much of what I would hear would be a support of something approximating traditional or even atraditional Marxism, which is why I organized the first part of my talk as an attack against Marxism per se.
I would say that what Zizek is defending is a kind of atypical Marxism.
And maybe capitalism will not solve our problems. I actually don't believe that it will. I've in fact argued that the proper pathway forward is one of individual moral responsibility aimed at the highest good. It's something for me that's rooted in our underlying Judeo-Christian tradition that insists that each person is is sovereign in their own right and a locus of ultimate value, which is something that you can accept regardless of your religious presuppositions, and something that you do accept if you participate in a society such as ours.
But how can you get individuals to individually take responsibility for something like global warming in a way that actually solves the problem? What is the free market solution to ecological problems like that? It seems like state intervention would be far more reliable. I think it was a great thing that we banned leaded gasoline. That decreased environmental toxicity tremendously. How much longer would we have had to deal with the lead pollution it caused if we waited for the market to deal with it? Would Peterson say that instead we should have advocated that people simply take the personal responsibility to not put leaded gas in their vehicles, despite the fact that it was economically advantageous to use it? Does he think that would have been as effective? Even the libertarian Nick Gillespie has said that passing a law against leaded gas was the right thing to do.
But you know, my argument here is not against you. My argument here is problematizing happiness even more. Look, this may interest you. I was years ago in I think, Lithuania, and we debated, I report on this in one of my books, when were people in some perverted sense, and this is the critique of the category of happiness for me, happy. And we came to the crazy result. After the Soviet intervention, Czechoslovakia in 1970s and 80s. Why? For happiness, first, you should not have too much democracy, because this brings the burden of responsibility. Happiness means there is another guy out there, you can put all the blame on him. And as the joke went in Czechoslovakia, if there is bad weather, a storm, oh, this communist screwed it up again. That's one condition of happiness. The other condition, much more subtle one, is, and this was done in Czechoslovakia, those dark times after the life was relatively, moderately good, but not perfect. Like, there was meat all the time. Maybe once a month there was not meat in the stores. It was very good to remind you how happy you are the other time.
This is a problem I have with the premise of this debate. It's about whether Marxism or capitalism is better for happiness. But what makes people happy is so much more complex than merely what economic system they live in. There's also a lot of vagueness and subjectivity involved in even defining what happiness is. How could you possibly have a conclusive debate about such a thing?
Well, at one point, I'm ready to claim, where did you find this? This goes maybe for today's politically correct jerks and so on, that this egalitarianism. There is one passage in his late critique of Gotha program where Marx directly accesses the problem of equality. And he dismisses it as a strict bourgeois category.
One of Peterson's chief complaints about Marxism is that it advocates equality of outcome, but Zizek points out that it explicitly does not.
Explicitly. For him, communism is not egalitarianism. It's, yes, hierarchies, but not based on capitalism. Okay.
There are still hierarchies in the Marxist system, it's just that they aren't class hierarchies.
I agree with you on many points, but you know what's my problem with my problem that I was aiming at? With all the openings I know, we don't know really what is happening with ecology and so on. And this is okay, let's take oceans. You mentioned them. But isn't it, for me, correct me if I'm wrong, and I don't mean this rhetorically, maybe I'm really wrong, but the problem of oceans, the only way for me is some kind of cooperated international action and so on. You cannot simply leave it to the market. That's what I'm saying.
Exactly. How can cleaning your room fix the oceans? How can individual personal responsibility rather than coordinated action address this problem?
You're a strange Marxist to have a discussion with. And, well, but here's why. This is not an insult by any stretch of the imagination.
No.
I mean, one of the things that struck me when I was looking at your work was that well, first of all, you're a character, you know, and that's an interesting thing. Like
Is this an insult or not?
It's not an insult. It's a sign of originality, and it's a sign of a certain amount of moral courage, and it's a sign of a certain temperament, and it makes you humorous and charismatic and attractive, and I think you appeal to young people the way that outside intellectual rebels appeal to young people, and so those are all positive things that can be used positively or negatively. And my question is, like, it seems to me that your reputation, unless I'm very misinformed about this, is as a strong supporter of Marxist doctrines on the left, or was that. And so then my question is, given the originality of your thought, why is it that you came to presume at some point in your life, perhaps not now and perhaps still, that the promotion of Marxism rather than Zizekism was appropriate?
Finally, Peterson comes to understand what he's getting into with Zizek. Zizek is billed and bills himself as a Marxist in part because it stirs the pot. He even said that he uses that term partly to be provocative. Also, I don't think Zizek's politics is particularly original. The idea of leaving capitalism in place but using the state to restrain or steer it to some degree is not exactly rare. It's arguably the world's most common political position given that it's what the vast majority of states and economies actually do. Other than that, you can agree with quite a few things Marx Marx said and still side with capitalism. Even if you don't agree with Marx's prescriptions, his descriptions of how economics works are often insightful.
You know what I still admire nonetheless in Marx? Not those simplicities of Communist Manifesto, but I still think that his so-called critique of political economy, capital, and so on, is a tremendous achievement as a description of the dynamics of capitalist society. And if you read it closely, Marx is much more ambiguous and open there. For example, he mentions, apropos what you referred to, he mentions that law of diminishing return, like why crisis will arrive necessarily, poor are getting poorer. But then he is honest enough to enumerate 7 or 8 counter tendencies. And if you read him closely, you will see that precisely those tendencies prevailed later.
So Marx wasn't as ignorant to the other possible ways the course of history could unfold as Peterson seems to think.
My problem would be with this one. What you describe as postmodern neo-Marxism, where is really the Marxist element in it? They are for equality. Sorry, where? They are for equality at these cultural struggles, proper names, how do we call each other? Do you see in them, in political correctness and so on, any genuine will to change society? I don't see it. I think it's a hyper-moralization, which is a silent admission of a defeat.
On the left, there has long been a debate between the extremes of class reductionism and class denialism. Oppression based on race and gender often gets a lot more attention than oppression based on economic class, but I think focusing on class to the exclusion of these things is just as much an oversimplification. Maybe a lot of folks focus on using respectful and considerate language because it's the easiest way to stand up to the powerful. It's a lot easier than trying to unionize a Burger King. However, I think Zizek underestimates its importance.
That's my problem. Why do you call... Give me... No, it's not a rhetorical question for politely saying you are an idiot, you don't know what you're talking about. It's simply, I would like to know, because you, and I like this often, when you attack somebody, you said aggressively, and what should? Read more, tell me, whom. So I'm asking you now, not read more, I don't advise you, but who are? Give me some names and so on, and who are these postmodern, egalitarian, neo-Marxist, and where do you see any kind even of Marxism? I see in it mostly an impotent, an utterly impotent moralization.
While I don't agree that the politically correct university professors that Peterson calls postmodern neo-Marxists are utterly impotent, they clearly seem to me to be far less powerful and influential in the West than the right wing. In the US, for example, the left controls very little. Fox News, and to some extent Peterson, would have you believe that a Bolshevist dictatorship is waiting right outside the White House doorstep. But when conservatives try to explain exactly how the left would gain power, they usually resort to guesses about some secret deep state machinations or conspiracy theories. Peterson himself believes that Bill C-16, which only says that it's just as illegal to discriminate against trans people as it is to discriminate against black folks, is secretly part of a hidden agenda to achieve SJW supremacy or something.
So, yeah, that the whole bloody Stalinist, the whole Stalinist catastrophe, along with the entire Maoist catastrophe, that they didn't really have a leg to stand on. And instead of revising their notion that human history, and this is a Marxist notion, should be regarded as the eternal class struggle between the economically deprived and the oppressors, they just recast it and said, well, it's not based on economics, it's based on identity, but it's still fundamentally oppressor against oppressed. And to me, that meant that they smuggled the fundamental narrative of Marxism and many of its goals back into the argument without ever admitting that they did so. Now, I've been criticized, for this supposition because people who are postmodernists say, look, one of the hallmarks of postmodernism is skepticism of meta-narratives. It's like, I know that perfectly well. And I also know that Marxism is a meta-narrative, and so you shouldn't be able to be a postmodernist and a Marxist. But I still see the union of those two things in the insistence that the appropriate way to look at the world is to view it as the battleground between groups defined by a particular between individuals defined by a particular group identity, so that the group identity becomes paramount, and then the proper reading is always oppressor versus oppressed.
This too seems to me to be a conspiracy theory. It seems to me like Peterson is saying that the whole worldview of postmodernism is a lie. Peterson acknowledges that the stated position of postmodernism is skepticism toward meta-narratives, but that they've sneakily insinuated the meta-narrative of oppressor versus oppressed into the worldview.
Of your slogans in your book, first set your house in order, then. But I have an extremely common sense, naive question here. But what if in trying to set your house in order, you discover that your house is in disorder precisely because the way the society is messed up, which doesn't mean, okay, let's forget about my house. But you can do both at the same time, and I would even say, I will give you now the ultimate example, yourself. Isn't it that you are so socially active? Because you realize that it's not enough to tell to your patient, set your house in order. Much of the reason of why they are in disorder, their house, is that there is some crisis in our society and so on and so on. So my reproach to you, benevolent, would have been, that joke, tea or coffee, yes please. Like individual or social, yes please, because this is obvious in extreme situation. Like I hope we agree to say to somebody in North Korea, set your house in order. No, haha.
This is one of the silliest things about Peterson's philosophy. Yes, you should try to take care of your own affairs, but he seems to openly discourage trying to address the affairs of society at large in many cases. This is silly because not every person who helped change society for the better had their own house perfectly in order. If you dig into the personal lives of even the most positively consequential people in history, you will see that they had all kinds of problems that they either neglected to address or didn't competently address. You don't have to have your own house in order before you take on the problems of society as a whole. Also, he seems to want us to treat the interaction between the personal and the political as though it's only one way. He wants individuals to improve society by improving their own individual lives, but is aggressively hostile to the idea of using society to try to improve the lives of individuals. That individual North Koreans could solve their biggest problems by reforming their own lives rather than reforming their form of government is, of course, absurd.
I believe that the central psychological message of the biblical corpus, fundamentally, is that's why it culminates in some sense with the idea that it's necessary to adopt, it's necessary to confront the devil and to accept your, what would you say, the unjustness of your tortured mortality. If you can do that, it's a challenge, as you just pointed out, that's sufficient to challenge even God himself, that you have the best chance of transcending it and living the kind of life that will set your house in order and everyone's house in order at the same time. And so I think that's even true in states like North Korea.
As I said, putting your own affairs in order will help you, even in North Korea, but there are huge problems, arguably the biggest problems, that I really doubt can be solved that way. I seriously doubt that everybody in Korea having a clean room is going to make that country any less tyrannical. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.